This is the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. And now, Rebecca Larson.
I'm Rebecca Larson, host of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast and owner of tudorsdynasty.com. Telling the stories of those who lived centuries before us is what I enjoy doing most. Whether it be a show on one subject or an interview with an author or historian, I'll bring you the tales of 16th century England. Nicola Cornick is an international best-selling author and award-winning historical novelist who has written more than 30 books. In this episode, Nicola and I chat about Henry VIII and his wives, as well as the subject of two of her Tudor-era books, Little Mary Seymour and Amy Robsart. It was quite fun to get to know Nicola better, and I realized how much we have in common. I hope you enjoy the show. But before I get started today, I need to take a minute to thank the folks who became new patrons since the last episode. Monica and Nancy P. Thank you so much for your support. Your support and the support of all of my patrons has meant the world to me. A full list of patrons can be found at tudorsdynastypodcast.com. And with that, Nicola, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
One of the things I want to start out with is to find out why you think people are so drawn to the Tudor dynasty.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? And of course, at the moment, we're seeing it such a lot with the release of Hilary Mantel's new book, the Wolf Hall trilogy. So, and each time a book comes out, there's an upsurge in interest. And I think people are just absolutely fascinated by the Tudors. And this is something that's interested me for years, really, why it has this appeal. Yes, I think, well, firstly, of course, it's very theatrical, isn't it? I think Tudor history. There's a lot of personal dramas going on, and I think we can either relate to those or we are interested in those in a kind of in a curious way as to the way that the characters lived their lives. They're big characters with big identities, the kings and queens of the Tudor era as well. And, well, there's lots of things within that, I think. I mean, you can't get a bigger personality, really, than Henry VIII, can you? So I think that draws people in and absolutely fascinates them.
I always like to associate the Tudor dynasty with American soap operas. I'm sure you have them there as well, where it's
yes.
It's the drama that brings you in and you can't stop watching them.
Absolutely. And I think the really interesting thing about that is that no matter the fact that it was hundreds of years ago, there are human issues and human emotions there that we can all relate to. So maybe not six spouses or marriages or whatever, but, you know, relationship difficulties, all kinds of stuff. It's all about the interaction between the characters. There's a definite, I think, a kind of celebrity element to the Tudors as well, or it feels as though they have become historical celebrities. And I think people are just fascinated by their lives.
So I'm curious, Henry VIII, do you love him or hate him?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I can't say I love him because I think I admire him. I admire what he achieved because I think in so many ways, one of the dangers, of course, of concentrating solely on somebody's personal life or their character, which happens a lot with Henry and his relationship with his wives, is that you then can overlook some of the great achievements of a particular age and it gets eclipsed by the more personal stuff. But I think Henry was an extraordinary man. I mean, so interested in music and in literature, and there's all that sort of flowering of culture during his reign, as well as great change progress during the Tudor period. So I wouldn't ever say that I loved him. I think my very first historical love was Anne Boleyn, so that anybody who treated her pretty badly was never going to be popular with me, and I've never been able to shake that off in all the years since I was a child, and just thought she was an amazing heroine. So that's probably coloured my view of Henry slightly, but I think being older and wiser now, hopefully I can see him for his achievements as well as the downside perhaps to his character.
Would you agree that at the beginning of his reign that Henry really wanted to be liked?
Yes, I mean that's interesting. That's a really interesting question, because he hadn't always sort of struck me as somebody who wanted to please people or somebody who wanted to be liked. But actually, I think there may be an element of that in there. It's very hard to tell, isn't it, when you look at somebody's character? I mean, it's easy to look at Henry and think, actually, he was just a bit of a megalomaniac and he didn't care what people thought about him. And maybe he did become more like that as he got older. But nobody is, of course, that sort of. There's nobody who's probably that clear one way or another. I mean, he was so likable, really, when he first inherited the throne, wasn't he? He was the great hope for the future, and such a very popular and a likable prince and a likable character. So I'm sure that there was an element of that there. He was popular and he enjoyed that.
When do you think the turning point was? Or do you think there was a turning point where people liked him less?
It would be really interesting to be able to go back and judge that actually at the time. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, oh, this was the point where it all started to go wrong, or, you know, this was the point where he stopped caring about people's good opinion, and all he was focused on was continuing the dynasty and having a son and this kind of thing. But I'm not sure at the time that was at all how it was, particularly with people's attitudes towards the monarchy at the time and how far removed that was from everybody's real life. It's kind of it's fascinating to think, you know, we're probably looking at it very differently now, and at the time, you know, I mean, he was a very popular monarch, wasn't he? Right through until, I suppose, he put aside Catherine, and that did cause some disquiet within the country, certainly. But yes, I mean, I think, oh gosh, I could chat about Henry for such a long time. I think he's such a complex and such an interesting character that even if you don't like him very much, you can't help but be completely riveted by what an interesting person he was.
I'm a fan of Henry in the respect of, I feel like, you know, obviously I'm not English, but from what I've read, it seems like he did a lot for the country with, you know, growing the Navy and building more castles. And, you know, maybe it was the whole turning on Catherine of Aragon that started to change the prospect. But you're right, as with our modern eyes, it's hard for us to judge properly.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, he was a great builder. He was doing all kinds of things, as I say, that kind of get eclipsed by the human elements of the story. And I mean, I love the fact that he encouraged music at his court, and that he was so musical himself, and he wrote his own music. All the sort of the flowering of that kind of culture and all that sort of thing that was going on. So yes, there's a lot to admire there. But yes, I mean, maybe people then also related to the human element of the story as well, and were really shocked and horrified that after so many years of marriage that he decided to do this. Although, of course, on the other hand, it was so incredibly important then, particularly for a young dynasty like the Tudors were, to ensure that continuation, that I'm sure there would have equally have been people who would have thought, well, you know, we totally understand his need to have a son and at least one, preferably a spare as well, to succeed him, because that was so crucial when you think about all the upheavals of the Wars of the Roses that had been taking place less than a century before, and so much of that hung on either having a very young heir or a king losing their heir, and so there was so much uncertainty around that. And of course, the Tudors were only really at that point where they were establishing themselves strongly, and they wanted that to go forward. So I actually, in one sense, have some sympathy for the way that he behaved in terms of trying to establish his dynasty. I just don't really admire the way that he did it. But with modern eyes, I don't think we could possibly appreciate that kind of ruthlessness.
Yeah, the one thing we always have to remember is that these people, while we call them characters, they were real people with real feelings and emotions. And yeah, I love that.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this is it. And of course, that is one of the issues that tends to happen when you have so much fiction about a particular era or a particular person. You do start to think of them as a character, because in the sense that people sometimes say, oh, well, so-and-so such a character. But you're right. You're absolutely right. These were their real lives that they were living, and very, very complex emotions, the play of politics as well, at a time that's really quite distant from our own. So trying to understand all of that mixture, I think it makes it a very, very complex sort of setup, really. But again, a totally fascinating one. I think we're all drawn in by those stories, aren't we?
Most definitely. I think it's his reign, the tragedies that happened within his reign that draw us to them. You're definitely right. This leads me to my next question. If you could ask Henry any question, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. Yes. I mean, I think I would come back to there's an awful lot of things I should ask him. I once went to Carlshop Castle, which was one of the ones that he built, which was a beautiful little place. And I'd love to ask him sort of technical questions about, did you have an input into designing places like this yourself? Because I know he was so interested in that kind of thing. But, that would all have to go to one side, and I would just have to say, how far would you have gone? How far would you go to have a male heir? And just to see what he would say to that, because I mean, he went a long way, didn't he? But I'd just love to be able to get a hand on how important that was in terms of, would he have done anything to have had to know that he had a son to succeed him?
So speaking of children, his wives are another reason why people are so intrigued by his reign. Out of curiosity, would you say that the loss of his mother at such a young age attributed to him having 6 wives? I mean, was he looking for that perfect wife, the woman who was like his mother, do you think?
That's a great theory, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, again, I think that's very plausible. Actually, I think I'm not a psychologist, so I although obviously the more that you study character and the more interested you are in people as an author, the more interested in that you become. But yes, I mean, I think there probably is definitely there is some element of truth in that. And of course, he did grow up surrounded in a household of women, and as you say, with a sort of that ideal wife and mother image there. But it's interesting, isn't it, then when you look at his wives, they were actually all very different in lots of different ways. So again, I'm not sure whether in the end it was just that single-minded pursuit of continuing the Tudor dynasty, the family name that was driving him, or I think probably the perfect wife. Actually, having said that, I've now talked myself out of that, because I'm thinking of Jane Seymour, who of course did become, in his memory, it would appear, as well as in that of other people, that kind of encapsulated that ideal of the perfect wife for him, and who afterwards he spoke of so lovingly, having lost her. Of course, that added even more to her perfection in a way, because she was crystallized as that perfect wife who gave him the son as well. So yes, I think that's absolutely right.
You just made a great point, because I was going to ask, which of his wives do you think was the most like his mother? And I think you're onto something there with Jane, that maybe she was the one that was most like.
Yes, I mean, well, maybe, I don't know, possibly Catherine of Aragon in the beginning, perhaps. I think their relationship might have reflected his view of what of what a perfect wife would be like. But there's something about that whole idea of Jane, who I'm sure, again, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because the way that we know these people, the way they've been interpreted and we know them now, the idea of Jane being quite an obliging, sort of biddable kind of a wife who not only provides the longed for heir, but is also so sort of an amenable character. I'm sure she must have been much more complicated than that, but that then becomes crystallised when she dies, so that no one else is probably ever going to live up to that anyway. And of course, in Henry's mind, I'm sure she's up there on the pedestal, along with the idea of his mother.
So who is your favorite of the six wives?
Well, it has to be Anne Boleyn, doesn't it? That was how I came to my interest in the Tudors, was through reading about the wives, because first my grandmother got me interested in reading historical fiction, and she had the set of gold books about Henry's wives. I can't remember who published them, but they must have come out in the 60s or the 1960s or the 70s, and there was a set of 6 of them in a gold box, which of course to me as a child was just so perfect and fascinating. And I think that was when I first read about Anne Boleyn and thought what an amazing character she was. And I think I've come to appreciate most of the others for their different qualities, but nobody's ever going to beat her in terms of on my heroine scale.
Yeah, Anne Boleyn is definitely usually at most people's top of the list, but you and I do have something in common, that we both like to write about the lesser known or less talked about characters of the Tudor era.
Yes, yeah.
Let's talk briefly here about your first book. Maybe not even briefly, because I love this subject. Your first, I think this is your first Tudor era book, The Phantom Tree. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was. That was my first. It was interesting actually, because I studied the Tudors at university, and I'd read a lot about them, but I'd never written about them before. So yes, The Phantom Tree was my first interest in sort of going into that particular topic. So yes, and again, a fascinating story. I think I'm particularly drawn to historical mysteries and want to explore them through fiction. And of course, that was what I did with that book.
And so tell everybody the subject of the book and what inspired you to write on that subject.
Okay, well, The Phantom Tree is really the story of Mary Seymour, the daughter of Queen Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. And, well, I can't remember when I first started to be intrigued by the idea of what had happened to Mary Seymour, because, of course, in the historical record, she disappears totally from the record as a child, and nobody knows what happened to her. And I mean, that is really the most perfect mystery for an author, because in the gaps between the historical facts and the record, your imagination can sort of flourish. So The Phantom Tree is a reimagining of the life of Mary Seymour, what might have happened to her after the record stops, and what might have happened in her life. So, yes, I mean, I think there were several different things that came together for me that appealed to me, and I really felt I had to write that story. First, as I say, there was this fascination with knowing what might have happened to Mary, or imagining what might have happened to Mary. And then also, I'm very fortunate in that I live quite near Wolf Hall, the real Wolf Hall, and I've always been interested in local history and the local myths and legends around that. So, of course, there's a lot about the Seymour family around near where I live. And all these things kind of came together in my mind, and I thought, right, well, I'll write a locally set book. I'll be able to visit all of the places connected with the stories. I'll research the background of what really might have happened to Mary, and come up with a reimagining of her life and her story.
And if it were up to Agnes Strickland,
yeah,
Mary would have lived a long life, right?
It was really sweet, I thought, how Agnes Strickland gave that impression. She really wanted Mary to have a happy ending, didn't she? And it was, and I was quite touched by that, because, I mean, I suppose when you read about the facts about Mary's life, and the fact that she lost her mother. Obviously, her mother died after childbirth, and then her father was executed when she was still a baby, and how she was unwanted by various people. That's pretty harsh. You know, the letter from the Duchess of Suffolk complaining to William Cecil about the cost of having to raise this little orphan child, and you just think, oh, that's awful. So I can completely understand where Agnes Strickland was coming from, because she thought, poor Mary, you know, we all wanted her to have a happy ending, really, and for, you know, to go against practically all the common sense and the proof to say, yes, she did. She went off and married, what was it? Agnes was suggesting a courtier from the court of James I, and you know, and founded a family that's still around in Northumberland. She'd got it all worked out, hadn't she? It's just that you can't really prove any of it, but that's so often the way. But I just thought it was very nice that it came across very strongly that everybody wanted Mary to be happy because she'd had such a rotten time. So there.
But as we know, the reality probably is that she died young, and it breaks my heart. As someone who's been researching Thomas Seymour for quite a few years now, I feel like when he wanted her to go with the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, that he thought he was putting her into better hands than with his brother.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was probably, it would have felt like a good choice. Absolutely, a friend of her mother's, and yes, I mean, given the very tricky relationship between the Seymour brothers, which is another fascinating subject, isn't it? I think, you know, that's a pretty sound decision on his part, on the face of it. And yes, and that adds another layer of sadness, I think, to this whole sense of Mary just being passed around a bit like an unwanted parcel, and, you know, who's going to have to pay to it felt as though nobody cared about her as an individual or a baby even. It was all about, well, she's very expensive, or we don't want her here. And you know, the same with her mother's relatives. You know, it felt as though basically nobody wanted her, and that if she did die young, then actually that would have been a relief and to a lot of people, that they didn't need to worry about that anymore, which is such a very sad thing.
They were also worried about having the money to raise her. You know, oh, I would take her, but I need that money. You know?
Absolutely. Yes, you give me all of this, and of course, I mean that was the trouble, wasn't it? That was what the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk was saying. You know, in order to pay for all of these people in her retinue and all the rest of it, I've spent this fortune on it, and nobody's giving me any money. And I suppose she's got a point, hasn't she? I mean, she was an expensive baby. Whenever I do talk about talk about the background research for the Phantom Tree, I always say that, because of course she had, being the child she was, of course, with such prominent parents, it was clearly felt she couldn't just be raised sort of fairly quietly and cheaply. She had to have all this. She had to have this retinue and these cows to give her special milk and all the rest of it. So yes, she was never going to come cheaply, was she? And that would be a burden for a lot of people.
It always makes me wonder, had Thomas Seymour not been executed, I'm wondering if he, you know, I love Thomas. I'm not naive. I'm not naive to the things that he may have done, but I also believe there are things that he was accused of that he didn't do, but that's a whole nother story.
Absolutely.
But had he lived, I get a feeling that he probably would have kept her close, since she was the daughter of a queen, or I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right on that, because I think one had the feeling, based on the way he wrote as soon as he had the child, having assumed it was going to be a boy, he then did seem very pleased to have a daughter. And so you have that first sense that it felt almost miraculous to him. My goodness, I've got this lovely baby girl, kind of thing. And so from a purely personal point of view, I think he would have kept her close anyway. But of course, knowing Thomas as we do, he would also have seen the great benefit of the fact that she was the daughter of the former queen as well. So there would have been a double reason there, I think, why he would have kept her close. I think that's absolutely right. And yes, things could have been so very different, couldn't they?
There's another subject for a book.
Yes, that would be very interesting, to write the alternative history of, well, both from Thomas's point of view and also from Mary's.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move on to your new book, which is going to be out in April.
Yeah.
And it's called The Forgotten Sister. And if I remember correctly, it's based in the early Elizabethan period, right?
Yes, that's right. It actually starts. It starts all the way back just before the death of Henry VIII, when Edward succeeds to the throne. So because it's looking at the early life of Robert Dudley and of Amy Robsart, it begins sort of back before, but then focuses on the first few years of Elizabeth's reign.
What can the readers expect from this book?
Again, I think it's a dual time story, first of all. So there's a thread that takes place in that Tudor period, but also a modern day story. So it's basically, again, I was fascinated by the mystery, as so many of us are, of the death of Amy Robsart. And I wanted to look at, a reimagining of that story, but looking at it as a historical mystery that's solved in the present. So that there are the two stories that run parallel to each other. So they have the modern day story has similarities to what happened in the Tudor story, but it's similar but different. I don't want to give too many spoilers. So yes, but that is what it is. It's looking at Amy's story. Again, I mean, another of the themes that I really enjoy in my writing is looking at women who have maybe been treated as a footnote to somebody else's history, usually a man's history, obviously in the case of Robert Dudley, and trying to explore their life and their character and say a bit more, tell the story from their point of view, really. So this is quite strongly from Amy's point of view.
How well do you think you got to know Amy during your research?
Yes, well, I did. I spent a lot of time trying to get to know her, I think, and it was interesting because, of course, I mean, we've all come across this. So often, she's the footnote. She's the person who's referred to either from the perspective of Robert or just as an add-on to his story. So actually finding the real Amy behind all of that is quite difficult. She's quite elusive. But I did feel as though I went through for example, I went through the household records, Robert Dudley's household accounts, and looked at things like where she was at a particular time and what money was being spent. And obviously it doesn't give a full picture, but it kind of helps fill it out and fill out the gaps. I certainly felt as though I got to know her, and hopefully I was able to put across her character and her situation really quite strongly in the book, because I mean she was in a particularly difficult, one could say probably intolerable situation towards the end of her life, and so I was very interested in looking at the effect that might have on the character of somebody who was in that position.
And you're so right to say that she is one of those overlooked characters, because, to be honest, I really don't know much about her life other than what came out after she had died. What can you tell us maybe about her upbringing or her childhood? What was her family life like?
Yeah, so she was actually the only daughter of Sir John Robsart and his wife. But he had an illegitimate son, Arthur, who's also in the story. And then he had married a widow who had step siblings. So she grew up with a kind of a very modern type of family, really, a sort of a mixture of all of the different children. She was the youngest. And I mean, one of the things that really interested me was that she grew up in Norfolk, of course, and the background, one of the sort of quite strong influences when she was in her teens was Robert Kett's rebellion in Norfolk. And so some of her brothers were involved in that, and so there was this kind of background of conflict. She was aware of what would happen when there was a rebellion against the crown, and what it was like to have family who'd been drawn into that. Her father was actually a very prominent gentleman in Norfolk, so he was quite influential, but obviously she was nowhere near the sort of social, the dizzy heights of somebody. Well, the Dudley family had kind of gone up and down in terms of their fortune, hadn't they? But it was considered an exceptionally good match for her to be marrying Robert Dudley. So that was the kind of the background to it, and very, for me, it's sort of really interesting exploring the sort of marriages that her sisters made into the local gentry and the things that her brothers became involved with, because it was further down the social scale, but it was important enough to Robert Dudley's father that he should keep Sir John Robsart on side, supporting him. So, so he's clearly a man of quite a bit of importance. And of course, Amy was his only legitimate child and his only daughter, so she was again quite important to him. So there was all of this in the background. It was hard to get a handle on anything like what sort of education she would have received, but I did have the feeling that because her father had quite a strong interest in his estates and in the product of that in the farming and making money out of it, she also had learned the value of that. And again, I think I bring that out in the Forgotten Sister when she's asking, well, we've just inherited all my estates from my father. Why can't I have more of an active role in managing those estates? That kind of thing, something that she could have put her interests into. So yeah, she had a really quite a complicated and an interesting background, I think.
I'm curious now, what's the connection between the Robsarts and the Dudleys that the marriage between Amy and Robert happened? How did they know each other?
Well, I think the interesting thing about that, of course, is that it's always portrayed as, they met and fell in love, and Robert insisted on marrying Amy because she was said to be very beautiful. Quite a few of the people writing at the time who actually commented on it said, what a beautiful girl she was, and so it was portrayed as being a love match and sort of a bit of a kind of, they were very keen to get married, and there was some opposition to it, which I'm not sure is actually the case. They did actually meet when Robert Dudley came as part of the army to put down the rebellion, the Kett's rebellion. So. And of course, Sir John Robsart was supporting the crown, so he offered hospitality at his estates in Norfolk, and that was apparently how Amy and Robert first met each other. And as I say, it was kind of based on that idea that it was, they took one look at each other and fell madly in love, and Robert decided in that impetuous way he had that he was going to marry Amy. But actually, I think it was a far more hard-headed decision on the parts of the fathers, because as I mentioned, Sir John Robsart was an influential and important landowner in that part of Norfolk. It was a part of the country that the king wanted to sort of extend his influence over. It was considered an unruly part of England, the East Anglia, and so they were looking to establish stronger royal control there. So Sir John was seen as a strong ally. So a marriage between Robert and Amy would obviously put Robert into a position where he could then start to take up posts in that county and exert his influence in Norfolk and Suffolk, and ease him into there as somebody who could then become another influential landowner in that area. So I don't believe it was at all simply based on that sort of moment when their eyes met and they fell in love. I think there was a lot of manoeuvring behind the scenes as well that made it a good match.
Yeah, we always look for those love stories. We want that, love at first sight, and they went against all odds, and yeah,
I think there might have been an element of that in their story as well at the beginning, and I think that's very interesting because certainly, from everything that I've heard, and also if the one portrait that we have, which is said to be of Amy, if that is really of her, it is a very pretty portrait. She was obviously a very pretty girl. People did comment on that. You could see how that might have happened because obviously they were both they were both fairly young at the time that they got married, so it could quite easily have been quite a sweet romance, really. And then it had the extra benefit that it did bring this sort of this alliance that was very useful as well. So I don't rule out totally the idea that there might have been something a bit romantic about it. But I think you're right. I think there's always we want that to be true. But of course, if it was in the case of Amy and Robert, then it makes what happened later even more sad, really, that he should fall out of love with her when he was presented with a far more dazzling prospect in the shape of Elizabeth.
Yeah, it does. It is heartbreaking to wonder what Amy went through, how she felt with Robert being Elizabeth's favorite. You can't help but feel for her.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, she had no power, and this was something that I was quite interested in exploring in the book. If you were essentially in that situation and you were powerless and your husband was dancing attendance on another woman at court and he was saying, well, you're going to live here, and moving you around the country from various places that were owned by his cronies and just keeping you out of the way, what could you do to get some power back for yourself, to turn a situation to your advantage, to escape from that and find a way out? And that was really what I was looking at in The Forgotten Sister, coming up with a way that Amy could have, rather than just sitting there feeling sorry about it, because I think a lot of us would get really annoyed and want to do something. It's human nature not to think, well, I don't like being treated like this. So I was kind of taking that view and thinking, well, a woman in that situation at that time, what resources could she have? What could she do to change that? And I found that a very interesting way of looking at Amy's situation, because so often she's another of these characters. Slight tangent here, but one of the things I did read when I was researching this was Kenilworth by Sir Walter Scott, because of course the plot of that is about Robert Dudley. It's about Amy's death, and it's about Elizabeth, and of course the Victorian ideal of the beautiful tragic heroine. I mean, Amy was completely powerless in that and treated terribly badly. But of course, she then comes across as a bit of a wet blanket, and we want our heroines to have a bit more of something about them. So I thought, well, I don't want to write a story like that. I want to show her as a rounded person who might think, this isn't good enough. I'm not going to be treated like this. What can I do about it? So that was my viewpoint I was taking when I was writing Amy's story.
I love that. I love being able to give them a voice, maybe a voice that they wish they had been able to have in their lifetime.
Yes, I mean, I think that's it. We don't know, do we? I mean, when you look at the lives of women in Tudor England and indeed in other periods of history, there were those who were able to be strong and assert themselves and achieve certain things, either people like Bess of Hardwick, but also through softer methods of power. So a lot of women were not entirely powerless, but of course we have to accept that they certainly couldn't behave in the ways that didn't have the freedoms and the sort of way of behaving that we could do. But that's not to say that there weren't things that they could do. And I mean, that idea appeals to me, and hopefully I think it does to a lot of people who enjoy reading about these people in history and want them to have a bit of agency.
And remind me, I think Amy was relatively young when she died, wasn't she?
Yes, she was. She was 28. So, yes, I mean, it was also, and she'd been married for 10 years. So it was, yes, again, you feel as though she hardly had time to get going in her life. And of course, she was childless. And so that was another sort of idea of a woman's purpose that she hadn't fulfilled. And so there were all these things that against her that kind of made her just really a cipher, a character that people didn't know very well, didn't know much about her. So yes, again, I wanted to fill that out a bit, how she would feel about that. And yes, and the idea of the life cut short, the potential that was there that was not fulfilled, really.
Without giving up the whole plot of your book, the question always remains, was she pushed or did she fall? Do you take a stance on this?
Quite often when I write well, nearly always, I should say, when I write historical mysteries, the stance I take as an author and the stance I believe in as a historian are different from each other. So for the sake of it, and it's a real conflict for me, actually. I mean, I think this is maybe one of the drawbacks of being a trained historian when you're writing historical fiction, because you want to be able to let your imagination roam and obviously to come up with a really good story. But the historian in me says that on the balance of everything, I think she fell. But that's not necessarily the story that you'll get in the book.
I love it. It's just such a great mystery. And like you said earlier, you're attracted to the mysteries. I'm exactly the same. There's something about being able to go back and pull up these old documents and look at them, maybe from a different perspective, and, have your own take on what you believe could have happened.
Absolutely, because I mean, in the end, that's one of the many fascinating things about history, isn't it? Because it's open to interpretation. We can't go back and be certain what happened in any of these situations, or talk to the people, or even understand necessarily from what they've written or said exactly what they meant. We're always interpreting. A historian looking at factual information and documentary evidence is always coming out with what they think is the most likely answer to whatever their question is. So, yes, and of course, fiction really is similar. It just leaves more space for the imagination. But I think that's the appeal of historical mysteries, is they allow us to come up with our own solutions to these things. And of course, and on that basis, you really wouldn't ever want the mystery to be solved, because then you'd lose something then in that, I think, wouldn't you? It's the enjoyment and the sort of the stimulation of it is in exploring the possibilities. I certainly would never want to know what the real answers to these things were, I think, 'cause that would spoil it.
Yeah, it would lose their appeal.
Yes, absolutely.
So The Forgotten Sister is out in April. Is it already out in the UK?
No, it's out in April in the UK, and it's coming out later in the year in North America.
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait a little bit unless we want to order it online. Then we can get it.
Just a little bit. And of course, there is always the Phantom Tree for anybody who'd like a different dose of Tudor history in the meantime.
I will be buying the Phantom Tree. I am so looking forward to reading that one now after all the research into the Seymour family and the curiosity that surrounds the future of Mary Seymour.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. So now we get to the part of the show where I ask the 5 questions, and I've changed them up a little bit for you. So I'm going to keep you on your toes.
Right.
So my first question, as a writer, how do you decide on the topic of your next book?
It's a bit of a mystery, I have to be honest. I've got maybe 4 or 5 different ideas, and I play around with them and see which one appeals or which jumps out. Often it's not the one I'm expecting. That said, of course, it also depends on my publisher, and they love Tudor stories. So anything with a Tudor mystery in it is okay by them.
Whatever inspires you, right? You have to have that inspiration. You can't force yourself to write something.
I've never been able to do that. I have tried sometimes, but no, I think it as I say, I mean, at the moment, I've just finished a manuscript, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to be writing next. So I've got maybe 4 different ideas. They've all got elements that appeal to me, and I'm just waiting for one of them to come through more strongly than the other. It's I'm not a very planned writer. In fact, I'm not a planned writer at all. It is all down to instinct, and like you say, whatever puts its hand up most strongly and says, "Write me next."
What does your writing process look like?
Oh, well, it's funny you should ask me that, because I have just, as I say, come out of writing my most recent manuscript, and the process for that was very painful for everybody concerned. I usually start off doing my research ahead of the book once I've decided what it is I'm writing about. before I start writing, so that I feel confident of the framework that I'm writing in, that it's going to be authentic and strong. And then I'll start writing and obviously keep on researching as I go along, because there's bound to be lots of things that I do. I do try to write regularly. I don't plan, so I don't have huge pieces of paper stuck all over the walls with timelines and other things on it. Which I should do, really, because when you're writing dual time, it can get very, very complicated and mathematical, and I'm not very good at planning, so I can get myself into a bit of a knot. But yes, the last book was just terribly difficult to write, and I must have spent about 8 months thinking about it and making very slow progress, and then suddenly writing very, very fast at the end, which never happens to me normally. So I'm not sure it can be dignified with that word sometimes. I just have to fly into the distance and hope for the best, I think.
Well, now I'm curious, have you ever written a first draft of a book and been unsatisfied with it and shelved it?
Yes, I have done that. And in fact, this particular book that I've just written, which is around the historical mystery of the princes in the Tower, so that's my next book after The Forgotten Sister, that I must have written about. I've started writing a particular angle on that, and then I scrapped it completely. So I must have written about 250,000 words there that just never will see the light of day, unfortunately, which is probably another reason why it took me so long to sort out what I was doing. In that instance, I think it was simply because the subject matter was so complicated and so difficult, and also so personal to me and my interest in history, that it was just very, very hard to write. But yes, unfortunately, I hate having to scrap things, because it feels like a terrible waste. But I think you do sometimes. If it doesn't feel right, then it has to go.
I asked this question because I am struggling with this right now. I'm on my second draft of my first novel, and I love where the story has gone. I love bits and pieces of it, but when I go back and read through it, I go, I don't know if it's right. And my heritage, I'm German, so I'm very stubborn, and I can't. It kills me to even think about shelving it, because I feel like it has to be finished, but I don't want to finish a bad book. You know what I mean?
That is so difficult, isn't it? And I do feel for you, because yes, you put so much work and so much heart into a project that you don't want to A, not finish it, and B, just put it aside. I mean, I think sometimes I critiqued manuscripts and things as part of my career, and I think sometimes I just say to people, put it aside for a bit, or look at the bit of it that you're not happy with, because there's bound to be something in there that you can work with and change maybe just a little. But yeah, it's a really tough one, that, isn't it? Oh, best of luck with it. I don't want you to put it aside either.
I know, it's the frustrating. And you have written so many books. How many are you up to? 30?
I stopped counting after 30. I mean, I have been writing for over 20 years now. I'm very fortunate that I've been published for over 20 years. But that said, I've only written 4 of these historical dual-time mysteries, and that they're very, very hard. I find it very, very difficult. So yeah, I'm not sure how long I can keep going doing this. But yeah, it's hard work. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, anybody who thinks writing a book is easy is delusional.
Yes, absolutely they are. They have no idea.
Well, my next question, this is one of my favorite ones that I ask all of my guests, is if I were to give you a time machine and you could safely travel back in time and return, where would you go?
Well, it used to be that I wanted to go to the Tower of London and find out what happened to the princes in the Tower. But true to my what I was just saying about not wanting to know the answers to historical mysteries, I probably wouldn't choose to do that anymore, because I might be very disappointed when I found out the answer to that one. So what I would do is I work as a guide and a researcher for the National Trust in England at a 17th century stately home. So what I would absolutely love to do is to go back in time to a moment when that house was at its height of popularity, when it belonged to the Craven family, when they lived there, and just to see what life was like there in the time. Because obviously I take people around the house, I tell them about the family and about their lifestyle and all the things that happened there, but just to experience that for myself and hopefully not find that I was completely wrong about it would be the most amazing experience.
If we could just be a fly on the wall.
Yes, indeed.
Well, out of curiosity, Nicola, when you are reading for pleasure, what do you like to read?
I do enjoy reading historical fiction still. It was my first love, and I do still read that. I read a lot of crime, and I think that might account for the interests that I sort of have in putting crime elements into my own books as well. So. And I particularly read that when I'm reading, if I'm writing, which is almost all the time, and I'm reading for pleasure in between, I won't read dual time books or historical fiction when I'm writing for fear of sort of that idea of accidentally sort of picking up things from other people's books. So I'll always read crime books when I'm writing. But in between, I love reading dual time books. Again, A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley was one of my first loves when I started reading historical fiction. I love reading Barbara Erskine's books, Susanna Kersley's books, and a friend of mine, Christina Courtney, who writes dual time Viking books. So those are really, really interesting. So anything like that, really, though, and definitely. Straight historical fiction, as I say, my first love, and I think it'll always be that close to my heart.
I love historical fiction as well, and I always tell people it was historical fiction that got me so interested in the Tudors, where I went, oh, well, these are interesting stories. Now I want to learn more, and I always hope that they do that for other people as well.
Absolutely. I mean, So, did you read? I was a Jean Plaidy girl, so that was what got me into the Tudors and the various authors like that. But and I think that's exactly what. Funnily enough, I was just reading an interview with Hilary Mantel about her Tudor trilogy, and that's exactly what she said as well. She said, I know that story and I want more of it, and I think that's what we all feel when we read about Tudor history, and what we all hope as well when we write about it, that people will identify with that story. They'll know about the background and they'll think, this is great, I want to know more about this.
Well, now my last question for you is, what might people be surprised to learn about you?
Oh, about me personally? That's a very good question. Well, I don't know whether it would be surprising, but I do have another activity that I'm involved which is completely different from writing, which is that I train assistance dogs, guide dog puppies for the blind. So that when I'm not writing and when I'm not working at Ashdown House, I'm out. It's good actually, because it gets me away from my desk and out meeting people, and I love dogs. So what could be better than training puppies to be the assistance dogs of the future?
I love that. What a great service you provide for people. That's great. Well, Nicola, where can my listeners find you and your books?
Well, I have a website, www.nicolacornick.co.uk, and I'm on Twitter and Facebook. I love chatting to people who are interested in history and writing and those two things together, and indeed anything else really. So please do find me at Nicola Cornick on Twitter and on Facebook as Nicola Cornick as well. The books are all on Amazon, US and UK, and yes, and hopefully the new one's going to be out in the UK and from the Book Depository, who of course do ship internationally as well next month. So, but yes, the US edition of The Forgotten Sister is coming in the autumn, and it has an awesome cover, really, really stunning. So I'm very excited about that. So that's where you can find me, and I look forward to chatting to everybody, and thank you.
And if you are looking forward to purchasing one of Nicola's books, I will include the links on the subsequent article that goes with this so that you can just click and go over and make a purchase. Nicola, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been fantastic chatting to you about all things Tudor. Thank you so much.
Thanks for checking out the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. Read more on the blog at tudorsdynasty.com. Follow Tudors Dynasty on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to Tudors Dynasty on iTunes. Thanks for listening.